George Washington is probably the most evil president in the untold history of the United States. From Washington's entanglement in the unseen chains of slavery to the unsettling town destroyer that stained his military legacy. But here's the twist. We're not just exposing the obvious. No, there's a hidden narrative so intriguing that it will only leave you craving more. The Unseen Chains, Washington and Slavery. Did you know George Washington, the face on your dollar bill, had a darker side? Forget the folklore, we're about to unravel the uncomfortable truths about Washington's involvement in slavery. Spoiler alert, it's most definitely not a bedtime story. At just 11 years old, his father passes away. And what does young George inherit? Not just a 280-acre family farm, but 10 enslaved individuals too. Fast forward to his adult years, and it's not exactly the tale of a benevolent founding father we were taught. And Washington's slave ownership portfolio expanded, not contracted. In 1755 alone, he purchased 4 men, 2 women, and a child. And then comes Martha Custis. She brings a whopping 84 enslaved workers into the mix when the 2 of them tie the knot and get married. Mount Vernon became less a symbol of freedom and more a hub of forced labor because in the 16 years that followed, Washington purchased 40 more slaves. And accounts from neighbors described him as treating slaves with more severity than others. The truth is, Washington's slaveholding habits were not just a footnote in his legacy, they were unfortunately a very, very defining feature. Now let's talk about a plot twist. During the Revolutionary War, something seemingly changed. Washington's exposure to regions where agriculture thrived without slave labor seemed to have some sort of an impact. He even allowed free black soldiers into the Continental Army, a move he had opposed before. In 1786, he wrote about desiring a slavery abolition plan, advocating for legislative action. He stated, "I hope it will not be conceived from these observations that it is my wish to hold the unhappy people, who are the subject of this letter, in slavery. I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." But hold on, does this mean he stopped using slave labor? Nope, not even close. His actions very clearly told a very different story. When he moved into the presidential home, he and Martha brought enslaved workers from Mount Vernon, forcefully separating them from their families. This contradiction reached its peak in 1793, when Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. So imagine this, the guy who once wished for the abolition of slavery is now signing an act that ensures escaped slaves could now be captured and returned to slavery. A complete disregard for his earlier call for abolition. This act also made it a federal crime to help escaped slaves and put them at risk of being dragged back into a life of servitude for as long as they lived. The act coincidentally was written during a very controversial situation where a free black man named John Davis was kidnapped from Pennsylvania and taken to Virginia, forced into slavery. Washington went from revolutionary ideals to, well, capturing those who sought freedom. Irony much? Now, let's zoom in on the human impact. We'll take a very prominent case. Meet Ona Judge, born into slavery, trained to become a housemaid, torn from her family at 16, forced into servitude in the president's house. The worst part is that despite her father being a free man, Ona was considered property of Martha. Why? Because Ona's mother was Martha's slave. Her exposure to a free black community in Philadelphia sparked the hope of a life beyond chains. But the possibility of escape was never without the horrific consequences, because this evil president was known for whipping those who disobeyed him by trying to escape, and were even sold to plantations in the Caribbean, where the working conditions were nothing far from complete and utter oppression. Now, taking you even deeper into how little of humans they thought of slaves to be, let's look at what happens next. In March 1796, Martha's granddaughter, Eliza Custis, gets married, and as a wedding present, Ona is given to the newlywed couple. not only ripping her away from her life in Philadelphia and the possibility of returning to her family in Mount Vernon, but also treating her like some toy to be given away. Not to mention Eliza being famous for her abusive nature, anger issues, and unpredictable personality. In 1796, she seized her chance, escaping to New Hampshire. Washington's attempts to retrieve her only intensified her fight for freedom. These included film-level messed up things like failed kidnappings, manipulation of false job offers, and prize money for her capture. As Washington tried to bring Ona back, she built a new life in New Hampshire, marrying and raising a family. Despite the president's persistent efforts, Ona remained free until her passing in 1848. Her story captures the contradictions and struggles embedded in Washington's legacy. Then you might have heard the tale that Washington freed his enslaved workers upon his death. Well, let's unmask that story. At the time of his death, Washington owned 123 enslaved people because he most definitely did not free his slaves during his lifetime. In his will, he did state their eventual freedom, but here's the catch. The ownership passed to Martha after his death. So the so-called freedom was just a transfer from one form of bondage to another. While Martha did choose to free one of them, William Lee, the others remained in bondage, nursing a growing resentment. Washington's promise of freedom was, in reality, an empty gesture. Martha, now the owner of the enslaved workers, faced challenges. Rumors of poisoning and a fire at Mount Vernon added fuel to the already tense situation. In January of 1801, faced with mounting pressure, Martha finally freed Georgia's enslaved workers. However, those owned by Martha faced a different fate, passed down to her children. So that commonly repeated fact about Washington freeing his slaves in his will, it was more of an empty gesture than a noble act. The complexities of his relationship with slavery go beyond the surface, revealing a side of the first president that history often glosses over. The Town Destroyer and Native American Displacement. Let's now dive into the next untold chapter of America's most evil president, one that takes us beyond the triumphs of the Revolutionary War into the shadows of the frontier. So, we've seen Washington as a slave owner, but now let's navigate through the rugged terrain of his post-war actions, where his military might turned toward Native American tribes who once fought alongside him against the French, where Washington earned a nickname that echoed through generations: Town Destroyer. It all starts after the dust settles on the French and Indian War. The Mingo leader Tanacharison had bestowed upon Washington the nickname Conotocoreus, a name that carried a dark legacy. This wasn't a newfound title. It had roots in Washington's family, given to his great-grandfather after participating in a massacre of native chiefs in Virginia and Maryland. Apparently, evilness is genetic then. But the real reckoning comes during the Revolutionary War. On May 31, 1779, Washington issued a chilling command to General Sullivan, a directive to straight up annihilate the settlements of the Six Nations of Indians, to capture prisoners of every age and sex, and to destroy crops. He stated, "Parties should be detached to lay waste to all the settlements around, with instructions to do it in the most effective manner, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed." Picture this: over 40 Iroquois villages razed to the ground during the Sullivan expedition. The very tribes that had once fought alongside Washington now faced the wrath of the Town Destroyer. The frontier was no longer a shared space. It became a battleground where the echoes of destruction spoke louder than wartime alliances. As if that wasn't enough, in 1789, Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, tried a different approach: treaties to purchase native land. When the tribes refused, Washington's tone took a sinister turn. He threatened to extirpate them, to destroy completely. It was a stark reminder that the frontier held its own battles, even after the cannons fell silent. And so by 1792, Washington's reputation was set in stone, and not in a favorable light. Mohawk chief Joseph Brant saw through Washington's smooth words, warning his people of the cunning Town Destroyer. A Seneca chief lamented the devastation, remembering Washington's army as the Town Destroyer, a name that still sent shivers through the Six Nations. Utterly failed leadership and judgment. Now let's explore another hidden facet of this man, the general with a mixed track record. Contrary to popular belief, he wasn't always basking in glory on the battlefield. In fact, he experienced more defeats than triumphs. But here's the shocker, he lost more battles than he won. Yes, you heard it right. While he did achieve success as both a general and a spy master, let's not forget the moments that would make any hero cringe. One of Washington's early and significant mistakes during the French and Indian War. Let's rewind to the early days of Washington's military career, the French and Indian War. Picture this, a 22-year-old Washington leading British forces alongside a Mingo warrior. They launch an attack that sparks a global conflict. In a clash with French forces, Washington, according to a Mingo eyewitness, fires the first shot, leading to the death of not only French ensign Jumonville, but a lot of Washington's own soldiers. What follows is not just a battle, but a diplomatic catastrophe. This seemingly unprovoked attack on French forces, while Britain and France were not officially at war, turned heads, and not in a good way. It was a diplomatic blunder that escalated tensions and culminated in the disastrous Battle of Fort Necessity. Washington's recklessness didn't just cost lives on the battlefield, it triggered a series of events that echoed through history. The Whiskey Rebellion. And of course it gets worse. The French and Indian War led to heavy taxes on the colonies, fueling the flames of revolution. Hold on to your mugs, because we're about to explore the one such tax, the whiskey tax, which led to a rebellion, where Washington traded diplomacy for a militia. The federal government decided to slap a tax on distilled spirits, including whiskey. Why? To recover some war debts. But the hard-working folks in the western frontier, especially those crafting their liquid gold, whiskey, weren't having it. Cue the Whiskey Rebellion, a protest that would put Washington's leadership and the federal government's authority to the test. Imagine this, you're a farmer in the backcountry, turning your excess grain into liquid courage. Suddenly, the government wants a cut of your hard-earned spirits. Not the happiest of times, right? That's exactly what sparked the rebellion. Distillers were up in arms about what they saw as an unfair tax targeting their way of life. Now, Washington, the nation's first president, how did he respond? Well, he didn't mince words. Washington, no stranger to quelling unrest, decided to flex the federal government's muscles. Washington himself donned in his presidential flair, leading a militia force to western Pennsylvania to squash the rebellion. It was a bold move, because instead of diplomatically solving his own created problem, he showcases the unfair power of the federal government and its determination to enforce the law. While some applauded Washington's firm stance, others questioned the use of military force against their fellow citizens. It was a test of the young nation's commitment to federal authority, and not everyone was on board with the president's approach. The incident raised concerns about the potential abuse of power and the delicate balance between federal authority and individual liberties. Internal military strife and the Conway Cabal. Imagine this, the Revolutionary War is in full swing, and George Washington is at the helm of the Continental Army. But hey, it's not all grandeur and triumph. In fact, Washington faced setbacks and challenges that would have tested the strongest of leaders. The battlefield wasn't just a stage for glory, it was a testing ground for Washington's leadership, and the road to victory was anything but smooth. Ever heard of the Conway Cabal? It sounds like something out of a historical thriller, but it was a real test of Washington's leadership. The Conway Cabal was a group of senior Continental Army officers in late 1777 and early 1778. And they had one aim, which was to have him replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, simply because they thought he was incompetent due to his current military situations and past defeats. A storm of internal divisions, doubts about Washington's capabilities, and whispers of discontent among the ranks. While Washington stood firm against external foes, he also had to navigate the internal challenges within his own camp. Washington's ability to quell these internal storms was crucial for the survival of the Continental Army. Maintaining the morale of a war-weary army was no small feat. The soldiers faced harsh winters, limited resources, and the constant threat of the enemy. And what made it all worse was the fact that they believed his leadership was basically of no use because he was leading them to failure. So there you have it, George Washington's tale, though often painted in heroics, harbors untold and evil complexities, from the unseen chains of slavery to the emergence of the town destroyer and diplomatic failures. Washington's legacy is far from the polished image we were taught, so we invite you to question, to seek beyond the whitewashed facade. Don't forget to join us in the future for further exploration into not just America's most evil president, but also other untold stories. Subscribe, like, and remember to comment about what else you'd like to see on History Duck.